Greetings and welcome to When Local Democracy Fights Back, a virtual roundtable on HB1 and racial justice. I am Kristen Jansen, Marketing and Communications Manager here at PRP, and I just wanted to welcome and thank you all for joining us today. And this welcome comes from 60 plus of our government office partners and 100 fellows who are in dozens of cities around the country helping us redefine enforcement. If you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself via the chat box and let us know how you would finish the prompt I am intending today to ensure. I'll go ahead and read some. We have Erica. I am attending today to ensure that my city is prepared for when the Ohio legislature follows Florida's lead. We also have Joanna. I am attending today to ensure that no matter which way federal or state politics swings, I can help to organize my local community and make sure that everyone is taken care of and has what they need. It's awesome. And now I'd like to introduce you to John Miller, PRP's legal director. He's an experienced litigator and government attorney with a deep background in civil rights. John was formerly chief of the public protection in the Massachusetts AG's office. He worked at the Northeastern School of Law and also attended Dartmouth College and Columbia Law School. So I will hand it over to John.
Thanks so much, Kristen. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We are just so delighted to have such a great group and so many great partners with us. It's just a really exciting opportunity to bring a number of networks together to provide a behind-the-scenes look into a case study of how community partnerships, advocates, and organizing can catalyze action by local governments. And we're so appreciative of all of our partners who have made the HB1 case become a reality. It would not have been possible without all of them. We've seen how the movement lawyering from the Community Justice Project, with its strong ties in South Florida, has been such an anchoring organization for our efforts. We've leveraged the strength and expertise of our Florida Coalition and panel of experts at the Local Solutions Support Center. We've benefited so tremendously from the litigation savvy and civil rights grounding at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the organizing and network among local officials at Local Progress has been a tremendous asset throughout our work. For Public Rights Project, this case is especially sweet because it brings together so many components of our work. Our mission is to catalyze the work of government offices, including state and local government offices, to engage in enforcement and rights protection. In this case, we're standing up for the ability of local governments to do that rights-affirming work. That power is being stripped by the state, and the local governments are pushing back. Through organizing, networking, community engagement, and other methods, we are mobilizing these 9 cities and their partners to push back against the overreach of Governor DeSantis and the Florida legislature. As we move ahead into the program today, I want to ground us in this moment and ground us in what is animating this very important work and what's at stake right here. This case is very much about the vibrancy of democracy and the ability of local governments to do their critical work. And this case is very much about racial justice. Throughout the themes of this discussion, you will hear both topics come to the fore throughout. Today's case study is going to be presented in 3 parts. Part 1 is to give some context about HB1, how it has been designed to chill and criminalize Floridians from exercising their First Amendment rights to protest and to stop local governments from responding to those calls for change. In Part 2, we'll learn about how this case came together, how advocates, community organizations, and local governments are working together to challenge HB1. And in Part 3, we'll draw some lessons from that experience and how the HB1 effort can be used to galvanize broader efforts, both at police reform and protecting local democracy across the United States. I'm so excited for you to hear from our panel, and I'm ready for us to dig in. We are joined today by 4 incredible, talented and insightful panelists to provide different perspectives on the work that has come to building the HB1 case. And you actually hear from 5 different contributors throughout the course of this session, and we'll take a moment to introduce each one of them. Marissa Roy is a staff attorney at Public Rights Project and also serves as a legal team lead at the Local Solutions Support Center. Her experience includes working in local government offices as a deputy city attorney for the city of Los Angeles. Gail Johnson is a founding member of the Local Progress Florida organizing chapter. She's a former city commissioner in Gainesville, Florida, and has been the driving force behind this litigation from the very beginning. Beth Foster is a senior staff attorney at Community Justice Project in Florida. She's an experienced advocate and litigator working deeply in the communities of South Florida to protect some of its most vulnerable residents. Fran Menace is co-founder and board chair of the Black Collective. She's a deputy organizing director at Local Progress, and we will be hearing from her throughout the sessions, providing some insights to join in the conversation. Fran has been a galvanizing force throughout this effort to bring community after community into the fold in this litigation. And we're also joined by Legia Gong, Policy and Legal Director at Local Progress, previously as counsel with us at Public Rights Project. She is a tremendous strategist and attorney who saw the opportunity in this HB1 case from the very beginning and has been a driving force to get us from that idea to action with the HB1 filing just a couple weeks ago. And so I'm so pleased to welcome all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Legia now to begin the conversation.
Thanks, John. It's great to see so many people that I know on this call. And this story that we're going to tell today about how this litigation has come together is really a story about collaboration and also overcoming some pretty challenging obstacles that were in our way. And I would really be remiss if I didn't share that one of the parts of the collaboration that has really flourished for me personally is that it's also led to my joining Local Progress in kind of working on this project together. I've subsequently went to kind of continue my career in pushing local governments and supporting local governments to fight for racial justice kind of in a different organization. So I just wanted to kind of share that at the outset. And I think it's kind of like a nice personal anecdote about how awesome the collaboration has gone. And maybe before we start, I'll just also remind folks to insert any questions that you have into the Q&A feature of Zoom. And then, as John said, we're going to kind of talk about the case context and why HB1 was a law that we really needed to bring everyone together to fight. And no one could do a better job of introducing this than my colleague, Fran Menace, who is just such an incredible activist and organizer. And so we're going to share a video of her as she kind of sets the context and backdrop for this.
I just really always want to center this understanding of this piece of legislation just really on cause and effect, causation of people mobilizing, anger, frustration, Black lives being murdered at the hands of law enforcement, and communities organizing, mobilizing, envisioning, reimagining what public safety would look like for them. And so as communities basically during the summer in this huge racial reckoning where we are forcing this country to have to look itself in the mirror and really understand what its history is and what it has been like to treat Black people as if they are nothing. And so we have gotten to this point as we mobilize to say that this is what our community needs and this is what we deserve. And so then what you saw was a governor using the election as a moment to basically amplify his platform for whatever political purposes he has down the line, and introduced what he called an anti-riot bill, when there were no riots in the state of Florida. And so we always made sure that people understood this was an anti-protest. This was around our First Amendment right to peacefully assemble and demand and use our voice, which we have seen historically has been used as a way to actually usher in change in this country. And so our governor felt it necessary to actually strip that power away from our communities. And by doing so, also layered it with what we call preemption, state interference, saying that the government that is closest to the people, the government that makes decisions on our day-to-day lives, that can shift the resources in the ways that the community needs, the governor will take that power away from them as well. So we had to educate our people, and we had to organize, and we had to fight. And part of that fight was around, how do we use the courts? How do we litigate and shine a light on very clear bill that became law that was going to disproportionately impact the Black community in Florida because of the work that we were doing, not just here in Florida, but around the country, to be able to shift this conversation of a heavy-handed law enforcement to be able to reimagine what public safety looked like for our communities.
As you can see, it is so incredible working with Fran and having her on this team to keep us grounded in what this is really about. So I'm going to start just with a broad overview of what HB1 does. I mean, focusing on the preemption and budget control aspects, we're really going to dig in, and our panelists are going to dig in a little bit more about the preemption, budget control, and anti-protest provisions. But I just wanted to kind of share with you all basically what HB1 does. So HB1 gives Florida's executive branch, that's Governor DeSantis, and the cabinet the power to commandeer local budgeting processes. If a local budget proposes a funding reduction to the budget of the local police department, a state attorney, so that's the DA equivalent in Florida, or any local commissioner, including a commissioner who maybe did not vote for the funding reduction to the police, can appeal that budget to the Administration Commission, which is made up of the governor and the cabinet. And once this appeal process has been triggered, the city basically loses control of its budget, while the governor and cabinet have full authority to revise the municipality's police budget line by line, behind closed doors, and without the level of community input widely guaranteed in the local budgeting process. HB1 really sets forth no legislative standards or limits to cabin the governor's revision of the local budget. So, this is kind of classic preemption in a way, or novel preemption, depending on how you look at it. But I'm going to turn it to my colleague or friend and colleague, Marissa, to kind of set the backdrop on preemption and explain how it's working.
Yeah, so HB1 is part of a larger scheme of using what's called preemption. What preemption is a legalistic way of describing when one layer of government takes power away from a quote unquote lower level of government. So we have our three tiers of government: federal government, state government, and local government. And though there is a hierarchy there, there's an understanding that local governments in particular are what are called general governments. They're the government that is closest to the people. They're the government that is really providing for most of the day-to-day needs and the ways that we interact with government, from trash service to library services to the provision of rapid COVID testing and all of the pandemic responses that had to be carried out. Those were carried out by local governments. Local governments need general flexibility so that they can innovate and so that they can really listen and take in community feedback and respond in a way that's meaningful to the community and in a way that matches unique community needs that might vary from city to city. Some preemption is going to be okay because naturally local governments as small units, there might need to be some consistency among them within a state. So for example, a state might need to set some basic minimum standards for what minimum wages throughout the state, or what traffic speed limits are throughout the state, or in the pandemic context, what COVID requirements are going to be for employers, so that someone who lives in one city but works in another can have that clarity. But what we've been seeing more often is this aspect of preemption being used in a way to target local innovation and target local responsiveness to community needs. So for example, 25 states have taken the power away from local governments to be able to pass a high minimum wage and a living wage. 21 states have taken away the power for cities to require paid sick leave. So we're starting to see that this is not about maintaining consistency or good governance or good interaction between state and local governments. It's really about state governments trying to prevent local governments from working on behalf of communities of color and workers in particular. And that is something that HB1 is very consistent with. One of the other troubling trends in preemption is that it targets not only states' ability to, or cities' ability to innovate and to be responsive to local governments, but in the way it does so by taking away power, it actually takes away some of the core abilities of a city to function, some of the core authorities that they need to just do their day-to-day tasks. And one of those is budgeting. And so I'll pass it to former Commissioner Johnson to talk a little bit about why it's so important for a city to have control over its budget.
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. As you were saying earlier, and as Fran was saying, I was one of the commissioners that spearheaded this effort in Gainesville, Florida, and we absolutely are the ones that are closest to the people, right? We're the ones that are accountable to our constituents. We see them in the grocery store. Our kids play soccer together and basketball, and we are the ones that know our communities the best. And local decision-making power is absolutely essential to having an effective democracy. And HB1 was absolutely meant to have a chilling effect on how we allocate resources, but more specifically, how we allocate money within our budgets. And I'll just give you a couple of concrete examples that come from the city of Gainesville, right? So for example, last year we had a one-time expenditure for body cams for our entire police force, not just the sworn officers. And this was close to $1 million. Well, this is another big question mark for our community, because what happens this year? Is this considered a reduction this year? That's a question that HB1 brought up to us. Another example of this is we have a pretty, I'd say, really significant and effective program for at-risk youth here in Gainesville. And it was started by a police chief over a decade ago, and it's been situated within the police department, right? And for many reasons, one of them being a call from the community to re-envision what youth services means for our city, what it means for our county. We've really asked important questions. One of them being, should this almost $1 million program be housed within our police department? And the calls from the community were, let's rethink this. What would it look like if we considered either establishing a different department or moving this department, or moving this program rather, to, for example, parks and recreation. So these are all the kind of directives that we gave to the staff. And although we didn't necessarily get this accomplished for 2022, there's both the community push and also the political will to make this happen over the next few years. So that's another big question mark, right? Like, is this a $1 million reduction in police department, and what does that mean for HB1 and our local decision-making power? And I'm going to end with this. There are really layers to what we consider when we make budget decisions. There's tax revenue, there's our general fund transfer, there's workforce needs, there are union negotiations and requests, there's community input, and it's entirely, our budget process is entirely too nuanced to be hamstrung by a mini Trump, aka DeSantis, which is abusing his power to play to his base in a bid for, the presidency, essentially. So that's what I'll end with, and that's why it's so important that we remain and we retain local control of our budgeting decisions.
And it's not just Gainesville. Many cities throughout Florida have been really engaging in really different ways, which shows how much budget variation there can be. So for example, Miramar was deeply impacted by the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And they were so impacted that in the middle of 2020, they actually had to furlough their staff, which is extremely harmful as everyone's facing huge economic stresses as a city employee to be furloughed. So in order to avoid that next year, but also reconcile the fact that they didn't have enough revenue to meet previous budget projections, they implemented a voluntary retirement incentive program where they would give a bonus to those who retired. It was entirely voluntary, and it was open to people who had worked with the city for a number of years. That was once someone accepted that, then their position would be frozen. So a general city employee would be frozen for 5 years, and a police employee would be frozen for 2 years. Now, a number of police officers voluntarily opted for that. And it was that program that saved the ability of Miramar to prevent future furloughs. This is something that we should be encouraging, but instead it's something that could be targeted and taken up and reversed by HB1. Similarly, Lauderhill, another city in Florida, which identifies perhaps as a little more fiscally conservative, was similarly distressed by the economic impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had been having, and they actually lowered their property tax. But in order to accommodate lowering their property tax, they were already impacted in terms of their revenue. They voluntarily reduced their revenue even further. They are going to have to consider where they cut those, where they make up that loss from. And since police department is the largest expenditure, part of it might come from the police department. Now, these are flexibility measures that a state can't dictate from on high when it doesn't know the specific circumstances of Gainesville or Miramar or Lauderhill. And additionally, this is flexibility that we want these cities to have, because they understand the stresses their residents are going through. And they also understand what their residents want for a vision of the future and a vision of public safety. But under HB1, all cities are going to be treated the same, and they're going to be treated as part of Governor Santis's vision, as Gail mentioned, instead of the vision that the community members have been advocating for. And so with that, I think also an aspect of this that is really important to touch on are the other harmful effects of HB1 that are the subject of ongoing litigation that Community Justice Project has been working on as well. So I'll pass that to Babette to talk a little more.
Thanks so much, Marissa. Like my colleagues have been pointing out, HB1 as a bill and as a law in its entirety is probably some of the worst legislation we've seen for many years in Florida. Community Justice Project is currently litigating the most predominant aspects of HB1 that most people know about, right? So when we think about HB1 in the state of Florida, most people consider it to be the anti-protest bill, the challenges to and the infringement upon First Amendment rights of Florida citizens. And so Community Justice Project, along with ACLU and NAACP Legal Defense Fund, are currently litigating the federal aspects on behalf of community organizers and community organizations such as the Black Collective, Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter Alliance, Broward. Those are some of the plaintiffs in our federal litigation case. But we really see this HB1 municipal case as a vital companion litigation case. And although in the movement lawyering model that Community Justice Project normally operates in, we really do try to utilize litigation as a last measure or a final means measure if there's no way for communities to really galvanize and organize and build their own power. And so in this respect, we did see litigation as being a vital aspect to protect the rights of all of the community organizers that we work with to ensure that, one, they have the right to protest in the streets of Florida, that they will be treated equally under the laws here in Florida, but also to ensure that the very demands that they are demanding, which is appealing to their local governments and seeking to have the reimagining of public safety that Fran touched on earlier, that's the very thing that tens of thousands of Floridians took to the streets last year, demanding from their local officials, and for HB1 to explicitly not just combat and attack that the rights of Floridians to protest, but actually to also try to thwart the very demands that they were making. Really, this HB1 municipal case is a crucial element in recognizing and pushing for the rights that all of our community organizers are seeking.
Thanks, you all. I think I hopefully everybody can see the ways in which the attacks on local democracy and racial justice and efforts to transform policing really kind of came together in this horrific bill. And I hope everybody understands why we really all came together and needed to fight back. So, now I'm going to move on from the why, which hopefully everyone is very convinced about the why, to the who and the how, which I think, for me is really such a special part of this story. I think of the work that we are all doing is in kind of a movement and partner ecosystem, where the actions of each group are not necessarily coordinated or directed by another, but we're all kind of supporting a greater whole, and we're all kind of necessary pieces and components. And as this slide shows, these are the logos of some of the organizations that were involved, but we're talking about lawyers, storytellers and communicators, advocates, organizers, and activists. And we'll hear a little bit more about really getting into the nitty-gritty of how each of those pieces kind of came together with Gainesville and the additional cities that we got on board for this litigation. But I just want to emphasize that, this was really such a hugely collaborative effort. And I think that's part of why it is so strong. So now let's finally get to the story of how this case got started. And how it was developed. Really, a key initial element was having a champion. And, we have her here on the screen with us. That champion is former Commissioner Gail Johnson. And I think it's funny because the slide says identifying a champion. And I feel like we identified each other and immediately saw the ways in which Gail was going to be kind of the rock that was going to lead us through in this effort. Gail has been, as you can probably tell from her speaking, has been totally unwavering. She is someone who leads with heart, with values and vision, and someone who inspired community and honestly, all of us working on this case. And she's also just such an inclusive leader who we've been able to trust every step along the way. So I will just note that was kind of a key element and ingredient of us making this all happen and getting our first city of Gainesville on board. And so that said, despite having such an incredible champion, we still faced a lot of obstacles, and it was really hard to get the first city to get on board, the city of Gainesville, because I think, as I know there are some city attorneys or government lawyers on this call. I mean, it's hard to be the first one to take action, especially to take action against who we know is a vindictive actor in this scenario. So I'll turn it to Marissa to kind of talk a little bit through about some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think one thing that, just to continue to heap well-deserved praise on Gail, our champion, but I think one thing that really makes her unique is she sees the potential of local government to be so much more, to be an entity that really fights for people. And unfortunately, this is not always the view of what a local government's role is. And I think among city attorneys' offices, sometimes, particularly appointed city attorneys that aren't necessarily always feeling accountable to an electorate, there's a sense that the job of the city attorney is merely to protect the municipal corporation, and in the most risk-averse fashion possible. From a legal point of view, that's certainly understandable, but it takes a very narrow view of what a city can do and who a city really acts on behalf on, whether a city is simply a self-perpetuating corporation or whether it's an entity that's supposed to be representative and reflective and responsive to the people. And so we encountered some of that right in Gainesville. Gail was ready to be a champion for the people who had elected her, who had shared with her their struggles and their visions for the future. And that is a huge reason that she was leading the push against HB1. What we encountered was a reticence with a more traditional viewpoint of cities should not be engaging in civil rights litigation. Cities should not be suing the governor of Florida, even if they disagree with legislation, because they could invite that response. And so as a collective, as a group of movement lawyers, it was very important for us to help show each of the city commissioners what the potential for their role and what the potential for their litigation power could actually be, what they could achieve through the courts, what it would mean for the people to see their city stand up for their rights and stand up for the ability to be responsive in the budgeting process. And so behind the scenes, we were meeting one-on-one with each commissioner because Florida's sunshine laws, as they're called, also don't allow more than one commissioner to be in a meeting without it being a public meeting. So we met one-on-one with each of the commissioners to make our case. And really each time it was a meeting where we were making the case for, it wasn't so much about HB1 as it was, what is the role of a city when the state government abuses its authority? What is the role of the city when the governor takes a direct hit at communities of color and tries to prevent meaningful reform? What can cities do? What should cities do? Should they be on the sidelines and just do their job day to day? Or should they fight for their communities? And that was the conversation we were having 7 different times with each different commissioner. And I think it was very eye-opening to see how hard it could be for some commissioners to really wrap their head around taking that risk and seeing their role differently and seeing the role of litigation and their litigation differently. But ultimately, I think what got us the 4th vote, we had 3 very solid votes. And then I think what got us the 4th vote was talking about the future of the youth services program. And noting for the commissioner, the 4th commissioner, who had been a huge champion of making youth services an independent bureau, helping him understand that you had the onus from your community to be able to do this, and you've been following that. So part of representing your community is not simply pushing for that, but also standing up for your ability to do that in the first place. And so that helped galvanize that 4th vote. And now once we got Gainesville on, it ended up being a cascading effect. But each of those meetings were only a piece of what we did when we were trying to communicate that message. As I mentioned, there was this tension between what is the role of a city. And what really helped, I think, the City Commission finally see what their role should be was the incredible organizing work that was done, and that was led in particular by Gail.
Yeah, I found that absolutely the community organizing piece of this was crucial in the success of this. And in any work that I've done, I've made sure to kind of implement this inside-outside strategy, making sure that we had community support on the outside. And I always go into these like policy efforts with like very rose-colored glasses on. Like, of course, like why wouldn't we want to sue DeSantis over this unconstitutional attack on local governing power, right, and free speech? Of course, why wouldn't we? But as Marissa alluded to earlier, it really was not as easy as I thought it would be. And partially because of what she mentioned, that in a sunshine state like Florida, I can't talk to my colleagues. So really, one of the only tools I had was public pressure. And thankfully, there were so many residents that really understood the importance of pushing back against this. So I didn't necessarily have to educate people as much as ask people to show up. And when I asked them to show up, they did. I asked people to email the commission. There were, at least like 60 emails that came to the commission because of this, like in advance of the meeting that we had on August 5th. We provided people talking points. Something else that I did within about 3 or 4 days, and for other elected officials that are on this call or people that want to do this in the future, I would say start as early as you can. But within 3 or 4 days, I kind of personally called organizations and people that led organizations to sign on behalf of their organization, like both like kind of faith-based communities, both smaller, neighborhoods, faith-based communities, all the way to like national, the local chapters of national organizations like the NAACP and Moms Demand Action, Sierra Club. And what was really a big boon for us too was even like the president of NOBLE, which is the National Organization for Black Law Enforcement Officers, signed. So I would say amongst all of these groups, they represented like thousands of our constituents, right? And that was within 3 or 4 days of the, within 3 to 4 days before the meeting that I managed to kind of get this letter together. In addition to that, I, of course, did a lot of social media outreach. I created a Facebook event with very kind of detailed information about when and how to call in. I had very key conversations with leadership from the Dream Defenders who were pivotal in this. When you ask the Dream Defenders to show up in Gainesville, they show up and they show out. So they really helped galvanize a lot of people to both email the commission and also call in to that meeting. So we had a lot of people in that meeting, and quite a few of them were because of the Dream Defenders. And what you're going to hear is actually, we're going to play some of the callers from the meeting. So I think that's queued up and ready to go.
Good evening, all. My name is David Kaplan. I'm calling as a 16-year resident of the city of Gainesville, and also on the behalf of the organizers of the Education Equity Advocates of Alachua County. It's a group of 500 parents, guardians, and advocates who work for equitable education in our county schools. Just this Tuesday, we assembled peacefully across from the county administration building ahead of the school board meeting, waving signs, talking to the press. We were a small group of parents, grandparents, and educators hoping to make a difference for our kids and our community. But I got to tell you, with HB1 looming over our heads, some members stayed home, and those who attended admitted to being nervous about not understanding the line between what's a rally and what's a riot. And so speaking to you today as a Gainesville resident and advocate, I personally see that HB1 has had a chilling effect on community input. I see that the bill is intended to suppress protests of all types, but it's important to remember that the bill is really most focused on suppressing protests in support of Black lives. And that's why I'm proud that Gainesville could be the first city to take action over HB1. This bill and other recently passed laws and now executive orders threaten our local democracy, and we can only expect more to come. So I think cities need to push back on these continued attacks.
Hi, this is Pam Paris. I've lived in Gainesville for over 40 years. I came here to go to UF, and after earning my doctorate, I decided to stay because I love this town. It offers so much of what I value: great access to the outdoors, cultural events, the ability to learn from and value people different from me, and the freedom to live openly as a lesbian with my wonderful wife, and so much more. So I find HB1 to be offensive to me personally, as well as an affront to local control of our city. HB1 seems to be designed to undermine the authority of local governments, and if I ever needed an example of what structural racism looks like, HB1 clearly provides it. City commissioners need the ability to allocate the local budget and serve constituents effectively without interference from the state. All attempts to promote and impose autocracy need to be challenged. We have the First Amendment right to peaceful protest and to petition the government for redress of grievances without fear of state-sponsored oppression or retribution. It's time to show up and support a lawsuit to challenge the gross abuse of power given free rein in HB1. Therefore, I wholeheartedly support the City of Gainesville to authorize litigation brought by the Public Rights Project and Community Justice Project. We cannot remain silent. We should not wait. We must push back. Thank you very much.
I mean, as I'm sure everyone can tell, I feel so moved, even having heard this once before by these statements. And I think, as John has said in the chat, there were so many calls just like this. And, you know, that was organizing on behalf of both community and movement organizations, but also the work that that Gail was doing as an organizer too. So we've gotten our first win. Gainesville, how did we get to these 9 plaintiff cities that you see on this slide? As Marissa kind of described, it was a little bit of a cascading effect, but there was obviously work that was involved. And this is a point at which we decided to bring on the Southern Poverty Law Center onto our team, which I think, as most folks know, is an organization with such deep roots in the South and civil rights lawyering. And also, in particular, one of the members of the SPLC team, Bacardi Jackson, she really brought us to the next city that we went to try and, you know, bring the lawsuit to, which was the city of Miramar. And she connected us with Mayor Messam, the mayor there. And I'll just emphasize, in addition to all of the great work that SPLC had done, it was also her own personal engagement in the local community that kind of opened the door for us there. And then, of course, Fran, I'll bring her up again. She was really so crucial in the Local Progress Network in Florida, as well as the LSSE network in Florida, were really, really crucial to kind of securing the remainder of the cities. Local Progress in Florida had been spending years building membership, working with members and community partners across issues of housing, climate, immigration, public safety, and reproductive justice. Local Progress had been providing technical assistance to local electeds and training, and all of that work and support helped us to kind of build relationships to help move this litigation in other cities. So, I think one of the takeaways that we can that we have from this is that local relationships, deep investment, and base building really does matter. So I will now turn it to Burbeth, who will, talk a little bit about, we've been really focused on getting the cities together, but talk about kind of developing the team in addition to the lawyers, but all of the folks who are kind of doing the organizing in this broader ecosystem.
Thanks so much, Legia. Like you were saying earlier, it really was a really concerted effort between the team. Bringing SPLC on board was instrumental in creating those ties that we needed to the city. Like Legia said, with their long history of civil rights, really they opened a lot of doors for Public Rights Project to be able to put forward a really strong discussion on their legal theory of the case, and really utilizing Fran, both with her connections through the Black Collective, her grassroots organizing background, as well as with Local Progress, the work that she does there. She was instrumental in tying us to other mayors and other people. And we kind of just had to go on like a roadshow throughout the state, really just talking to many different commissioners and making the argument and being a really strong concerted front, showing that one, the legal theories that Public Rights Project really put a lot of work and thought and effort into were really strong legal theories, but also showing that the team had the years of experience that any city would feel comfortable being represented by, really outlining how even our partnership with a national Jenner and Block, a national firm, was really, all of these tools together was going to make this litigation as successful as we believe that it could be. And so really building out a team that has a civil rights background, that has ties to community organizers and community organizations that trust the work that we do, and then kind of showing that to local officials like former Commissioner Johnson that really believe in, the grassroots organizing that needs to be done, the push for racial justice, the push for social justice and economic justice. You really have to put the team together as a whole and make that kind of argument that makes cities and commissioners feel comfortable. And I think I can't imagine how many hours we actually just put into meeting with, again, because of Florida Sunshine Laws, meeting with individual commissioners to just explain to them how the litigation works. Mayor Messam was able to connect us through both county as well as statewide League of Mayor organizations that we also presented presentations on. And so it really was just like a city by city push that we did as a collective group and coalition to really bring cities on and really talk to them about what their individual circumstances were that would make them, a possible target, or HB1 provide a negative impact on them. Lauderhill has a different circumstance from Miramar, which is different from Gainesville, which is different from Tallahassee. Every city is just so different, but they all have that underlying element of really needing to maintain municipal and local control over their budgets. And I think the team that we put together was able to show them both the connection to the budgetary and the municipal and the preemption aspects, as well as the broader context of racial justice and what their constituents were really pushing them to go for.
And of course, we were able to file the lawsuit, and now here we are. And I think, although on one hand it might be a little bit early to talk about lessons learned, I do think the organizing to get to filing is in and of itself, I think, a huge effort, as you all can hear from the immense amount of work that has been done. And so, I'll turn it back to another clip from Fran, and just for everyone's reference, she's traveling today, which is why she can't be here with us today, on why this Florida matters within the larger national context, and some lessons that might potentially be drawn that have implications for preemption and police reform nationwide.
And so our attorneys have been incredible in the two lawsuits that are coming before us. Again, we have community on one side fighting for our rights, fighting for our voice. And then we have another lawsuit with our local elected officials saying that we, as the government closest to our people, should be able to listen to the people who put us in office to make the changes that they need, that they deserve. And so there's a lot of work happening in Florida. I know many people look at Florida as like the kind of model of like, let's see how bad it gets here because maybe it's going to be replicated out in the rest of the country. But what we're telling you is that we're here holding our ground, standing and fighting to make sure that what happens here doesn't happen in other parts of the country. We want to be able to see other parts like North Carolina and their governor and the willingness to veto that bill. We want to be able to say that we are stopping it here and that we are going to reverse it so that our communities can actually thrive and not just have to survive day by day, but actually thrive and not live in fear at the hands of our state government.
And if I could just jump in after Franz so eloquently put it, it really is this process and the lessons that we've learned here are really, Florida is kind of like an unfortunate breeding ground for these sorts of bills and these sorts of laws. And so really, organizers in Florida feel a very specific calling to really push back and a responsibility to show that Floridians have voices of their own. They're not just being led by a state legislature that's answering to a very small minority of people. And I think what was most concerning for organizers as well as for the attorneys in this litigation process was that we did hear from a lot of city and local commissioners who were specifically saying, we are not defunding our police. That is not what this is about. We are standing up for local autonomy and that's great. And we support that. And that is one really strong element of this case, but it's just one aspect of this case, because this really case is really, and HB1 really is about an effort by the state, by the governor and by the legislature to really stop this reimagining that communities are calling for. And so I think one of the lessons that we are learning through this process is trying to keep that narrative centered and to ensure that communities and community organizers who are pushing for that very thing don't feel that this just becomes a case about preemption and that this is not just a case about local autonomy, but it really is about the demands that they are bringing forth to their local officials that they want them to answer to. And so our hope here and our hope in sharing this story is to ensure that all the nuances and the different really important elements of HB1 in this litigation are not lost in just looking at one particular aspect of the case. And so I think for Community Justice Project, that's really just kind of really important to us. And that litigation is not always, as lawyers, we're not supposed to say this, but litigation is not always the end all be all, but that there can be organizing and connections made with community organizers and local officials that will last far beyond this litigation, so that no matter how this litigation turns out, are we building stronger communities and building stronger ties with people like Commissioner Johnson, who are really in this fight with the people. And that's really one of the lessons that we want to encourage anyone who wants to take on this fight with us, is to remember that those ties and those connections are really crucial and vital.
I just want to echo something Beth said, which is that combating preemption is really just a step A. The step B is then making sure that when the local authority is protected, it's used in ways that lift up the voices of communities and respond to their needs meaningfully and reflect their values. What we've seen here, and I think the reason why preemption has increasingly become a big part, protecting local authority and combating preemption has become a part of fighting for racial justice, is because cities have started to listen to their constituents. They haven't always been allies. I think that's very important to acknowledge historically, is that they haven't always been allies. They've, in many ways, built the police state that has persecuted communities of color and Black and Brown communities. But they've also started to listen in 2020, and that is what states are targeting. In the fiscal year 2021, that legislative session, we saw 24 bills authored in 9 states targeting cities' ability to reduce police budgets. 4 states ultimately passed bills: Florida, Texas, Georgia, and Missouri. And this is the first litigation that is challenging one of those bills. But it's not just about aiming at core budgeting authority. It's showing the transparency of how targeted this is at justice reform. Some of the other bills we've seen have been examples, for example, in Arizona and Tennessee, targeting the strength of civilian oversight commissions, so that in Tennessee now, all members of civilian review board for a police commission have to complete a local law enforcement agency's, citizen police academy, which is basically an indoctrination program. In Arizona, 2/3 of the civilian review board has to be made up of law enforcement officials who are not going to hold their own accountable. There's also been a push in 9 states to exempt body cam footage from open records laws, so that advocates are not able to see what really happened and what was recorded by body cameras. So this is not just tied to the defund movement, and this is not just one mechanism. It's not just about local authority. Preemption is being strategically used in the same way gerrymandering or redistricting is often used, to achieve a partisan outcome, to block progress, and to prevent cities from starting to turn the tides and respond and represent BIPOC communities. And so that's why this trend in preemption is really important to start combating early. But then it's very important to remember that that is not the end. When local authority in Florida hopefully is secured and defended, that will be just the first step. That will be when the work of organizers comes in to make sure that cities actually do start to reallocate their police budget and defund, and start to think about building a model and reimagining a model of community safety that really reflects the needs and values of their residents.
I'll speak a little bit about the lessons learned when it comes to the role of the city attorney. And I'll really return to the mission of Public Rights Project, which is to close the gap between the laws that are on the books and the lived reality of impacted communities. And I think what this litigation has really taught us is that all parts of government, city and state government, need to work together in order to make that a reality. What we learned is that when we had in Gainesville a recalcitrant city attorney, that was a huge stumbling block for us. But we, Public Rights Project and Local Solution Support Center and other legal organizations are playing a role in helping to envision what is possible with the city attorney, and then providing resources and training to actually make that happen. And I think that, city attorneys' offices beyond litigation, there are other opportunities, I think, to engage in this particular fight on policing and racial justice. There is work that city attorneys can do on using their advising power and defining use of force policies, and the defensive work that city attorneys are doing when defending their police departments. But I think that one of the lessons that we've certainly learned throughout this is that city attorneys continue to play a really crucial role in kind of making all of the changes and the future that we want possible. And I know that city attorneys can be incredible allies with litigation and bringing affirmative litigation, but also in advising and kind of pushing legislation and supporting electeds to develop really kind of groundbreaking ordinances and legislation to support communities as well. But city attorneys can also do the opposite and, continue to be a roadblock in some of those things. And so I think that is like an area where, obviously PRP is doing this work and it is so deeply needed. And I will, turn it to Gail to hear from your perspective as a former a local elected official and from this experience, what you've kind of learned and taken away from this.
So there are two things that are true at the same time, especially here in Florida, right? Is that even though there are predominantly white Southern legislators that are using preemption to really entrench white supremacy and take the local decision-making power away from us, from communities of color, and even though this is true, at the same time, wins really both big and small are possible when working with like-minded community organizers and organizations like PRP and Community Justice Project and everybody else that's been a partner in this. So the main takeaway, this absolutely was not an easy process. It was incredibly fulfilling. I'd say one of the most fulfilling parts of my short career as a politician, even though I don't like to call myself a politician, is that we should really absolutely keep pushing. We should keep organizing, and we should keep bringing people into the process. If you are going to embark on this in your state, I would say just start as early as possible, know who the players are. And I'm going to end with this. This collaboration, like I said before, has been one of the most fulfilling parts of my career. And I'll just go into like the soft, mushy stuff with this, right? Is, kind of alluding to what Barbeth was saying earlier, is that, the win is the litigation. The win is going to be when this is struck down in the courts, but also the relationship building that happens from this, the trust that's being built, the organizing that happens, because undoubtedly I know that, I will be working with Legia in the future, be working with John in the future. So that's building capacity amongst this entire movement. So that is also a huge win in this.
Thanks so much, Gail. And, with that note, I think we're ready to move it to Q&A. We have one question in the queue, but I think as Barbeth said earlier, obviously the lessons learned are continuing. We are just in the very beginnings of this litigation, and there will be much more to learn, I'm sure, including some probably interesting legal arguments that come forward in the case. But I think will be additional, more lessons about the collaboration. But I think I speak for everybody that we, feel really proud about what we did here. So, all right, to the Q&A. I think, Marissa, you addressed this a little bit when you spoke, but I would love for you to talk a little bit more about this. This is a question from Francisca. To the extent that the copycat laws have been passed in Texas, Missouri, Georgia, and others, do you know if and when litigation might be filed in those states?
So far, Florida is the first to challenge this law in court, or this type of law in court, I should say. And I will say that, before the Florida litigation, I don't think this had been on people's radar as something to challenge, again, because it is a groundbreaking thing for cities to do, to push back against preemption, to say preemption is a racial justice issue, and to commit themselves to this type of work. But one thing that has been another impact of this litigation that has been really wonderful is that we have been able to use this litigation to set an example, just the same way that Fran was talking about. Unfortunately, sometimes when laws are passed in Florida, they ripple out, but also when organizers stand up, that ripples out too. And so in a presentation about policing preemption and what that means, the city of Austin had a lot of questions for us. They had no idea about the litigation that was happening in Florida, and they've started to learn about that and engage in preliminary discussions. And I hope that they decide too to stand up for their authority and also for progress on this issue. So far there hasn't been any additional lawsuit or any sort of strong commitment for a lawsuit. But I think people are taking note from HB1 and are inspired to push back because of the movement they see that's being created in Florida.
Thanks, Marissa. And then we have another question. I'm glad that there's a lot of interest and excitement in preemption here. From Rich, we've got some strong and bad preemption case law as it relates to home rule here in Ohio. How did you reframe the legal work on preemption to racial discrimination issues in a way that can get past those legal opinions?
I think one thing that comes to mind in response to your question, Rich, is that home rule jurisprudence really can vary, and it can often tilt in favor of the state, which is why when you read the Florida complaint, you'll see that we actually brought 5 causes of action. This law was so egregiously written that we wanted to call attention to multiple flaws. Even though the theme of the complaint was protecting local authority and was very much grounded in home rule, one of the major flaws we saw was that it was a delegation of legislative authority to the executive branch with no standards. The governor could just suddenly take up budgeting, which is a legislative function, and rewrite a budget and then impose that on a city. And generally, any limitations of authority or any budgeting rules have to come from the legislature, which is why we put and emphasize that argument. So I think one of the key tips in a way is making sure that the home rule theme is very strong, but also that there are other causes of action. Often these laws that are abusive and tend to usurp local authority go beyond the bounds of what other constitutional protections exist in the state constitution. So making sure that there are other legal theories that help to bolster home rule. And then I think one thing that you mentioned that I also want to call out is making sure that the narrative of preemption, local authority, and racial justice stay intertwined. Just as Berbeth was saying about it's really imperative to make sure that the narrative of racial justice is centered. This is not about going and opposing any preemption law. This is not about preemption for gun sanctuary cities or something like that. This is about preemption that is preventing racial justice. And we wanted to make sure that that was very much centered in the complaint and that the two were showing to serve each other. And so basically it wasn't really reframing preemption so much as making sure we were calling out that narrative to say that preemption prevents local responsiveness. Preemption has these effects on communities, so that the judge would be able to see that too. And I think it'll be interesting to see of the legal theories if this presents an opportunity for judges to rethink how strong home rule is or what the purpose of home rule and who it serves. But even if there is bad case law, there are often other legal theories that we can pair with it too, because this is not just home rule, this is frankly bad governance. And this is the prevention of democracy, of communities being able to have an impact on justice.
And if I can just add, we have some pretty bad home rule case law here too, Rich, but don't let that stop you from being as innovative as possible. That's what the law is. It's all the gray in between that black and white. So there's always a way to reframe the argument. And as Marissa stated, we're really trying to couple that with some other really strong constitutional arguments. And I think if you really try to focus on what the intended goal of home rule is and what the underpinnings, some of those nice equity arguments, you might be able to put something really ingenious together.
I think, John, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to jump in with the question, and maybe we can start with Gail, but maybe send it around as feels useful. I feel like fear of retribution, right, by the governor, by the legislature in a state like Florida or Texas is just a real thing, right? That it can happen. It can happen swiftly. A special session can be called. And there seems to be not a lot of hesitation on the part of state actors to push back. So what's your advice for sort of how to combat kind of that concern regarding retribution when we're talking about and asking for kind of bold steps by advocates and local officials?
Where we are in Alachua County in Gainesville, we're kind of a blue dot in a sea of red, and we often inspire the ire of the governor. Like, we are absolutely a target, not only for the governor, but also for our state legislators. So we have, for example, like renters' rights, and we had a plastic. We tried to push through a plastic bag ban, and we eventually did get plastic straws banned. There was some litigation that we joined in as a part of for that. So inevitably what happens is that anything we do in Gainesville, literally, like, the governor's looking, and the next legislative session, something happens to repeal or make sure that whatever we tried to put in place, it does not work for our community. So we're a little bit different here in that regard, where we really just don't care. And we do what our constituents have asked of us in the past. But that's different than, for example, the city attorney who really, I think, was concerned about some of the pushback we could have gotten from from the state. So it's really a matter of just standing strong and being aware that this kind of pushback is necessary to advance, the civil rights movement and racial justice movement in Florida and America overall. Like, it's basically, what are you willing to take a stand for? What are you willing to use the resources for, either your personal resources or the resources of the city to fight? So to me, it's a mindset, and it's an understanding of, who we are beholden to. And that is, the people that elected us and the city, not Governor DeSantis and the state legislators that actually don't represent us.
Thanks so much, Gail. And we have another question in the Q&A from Todd. Given the breadth of the coalition, the diversity of interests, and the local units of government involved, how do you seek to inform consensus, make decisions, resolve conflicts? What does it look like to work together in this way? Which is such a good question. Maybe I'll turn it to Burbeth first to answer.
Yeah, happy to chime in. I think with this particular group, I think there's a difference between talking about the coalition of attorneys and then the coalition of cities, right? So I think whenever you're working in a kind of co-counsel situation, just understanding, and having a strong co-counsel agreement that kind of lays out how decisions will be made and how votes will be tallied if there is any sort of conflict is going to resolve a lot of any kind of internal strategy issues that you may think may come up in the future. I think when it comes down to the coalition of cities, it's really important for the cities to understand that strategically the attorney team really is guiding them through the litigation process. We work with some really great city attorneys, some not so great, as discussed earlier. And I think once we have established a strong relationship with those city attorneys and we're keeping the lines of communication open and they really understand the benefit of having an attorney for a client, sometimes can be a lot more than most people think. We mostly don't want attorneys for clients. But I think in this respect, when you're working with municipalities, I think a strong relationship with the city attorneys really goes a long way to resolve any sort of possible conflicts that may arise. So I think I can let anybody else chime in.
Yeah, I think I'll add that, when it comes to brass tacks, I think it's a lot of meetings and a lot of time with various groups of people and setting up different structures for communication with organizers, with folks who are doing communications, within the lawyers and different groups of lawyers within the groups of lawyers. We probably should have done this a little bit earlier, we did kind of a big picture goal setting together of like, what are we trying to get out of this litigation, but also not just specifically the case, which is like, win the case, but I think of all of this work that we're doing on transforming policing and fighting against preemption and fighting for local budget control. And I think, even though there was not full consensus from everybody in the group about what those goals were, I think there was, kind of what folks are saying that, that it's really important to bring together the racial justice and the preemption elements. I think there were themes that kind of came out that I think then guide the various actors in making the decisions day to day, because not everybody can weigh in on a particular decision that needs to be made, at that time. And then I think the other thing is sometimes we have to just take things slowly. I think, we made, slow and calculated decisions about when to bring people in. And because, it is a fragile, I actually think we have quite a strong and resilient coalition, but I do think that coalitions can be fragile. And I think that you have to build it really intentionally. And if that means that it's awkward because it's going to be like another 2 weeks before you get back to someone, like it's important to have those decisions and make sure everyone is on board. All right, I'm going to ask everybody like maybe a cheesy question, but I think I'm honestly curious to hear about what has been the highlight for you personally of working on this matter. I know that we've all been on many Zoom calls together, And there's been moments of frustration, moments of joy. And wanted just to ask everybody, John included, what has really been the highlight for you? So maybe I'll start with Marissa, because you're first on my screen, though you don't look like you're thinking. So if you need to pass, I can give it to someone else first.
No, it's funny, the moment that's sticking out to me. I've worked my entire career in California on behalf of California cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles City, Los Angeles County. And those were cities that were chomping at the bit to fight the Trump administration and to be on the forefront of a progressive and rights protective approach to litigating. And so I think this was my first time kind of working with a different approach. And there were times that I felt, like maybe I wouldn't be the best at communicating this, or there was something just fundamental I didn't understand. Maybe there was a divide that just wasn't bridged, a different approach. And I remember, and I think as we had to kind of broach that question, that philosophical question, every single meeting in Gainesville, it was difficult and shook my faith a little bit in how cities were going to stand up and whether they were going to summon the courage. And after Gainesville passed, and many, many thanks to the community organizers in Gale, we had a meeting with Miramar. And I remember how different that meeting felt, because first of all, right before we got to our agenda item, they recognized Indian Independence Day, which my mother's family is Indian. And it's important to us, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone else even acknowledge it before. And then when we got to HB1, their approach was thank you. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Of course, we want to stand up for our communities. Of course, we want to stand up for local rights. And every single one of them they took their comments, to ask great questions, and we answered them, but to say also thank you, and we're excited for this partnership. And I think that was a moment where, I had gone into that meeting, like, I felt very emotional because I both felt hurt on a very personal level, but then also felt like, oh, this is, as a litigator too, as a lawyer, there is an audience here, there are partners here, there's a mission. And I think it just showed me that this mission to bridge the gap between the laws on our books and equitable enforcement can be bridged anywhere. It is something that is universal, that is throughout our country. And I think we just need to find the opportunities to really uplift that and to figure out the partnerships to make that a reality. And so I think that was a really big moment where I just felt so at home in Florida as a person and a lawyer.
I would say that one of the big moments for me, like, it makes sense, but it was literally when, like, the fourth vote happened and it was an aye. And like at that moment, everything kind of came to the forefront. All of the hours of meetings that we had, right? Like all the back and forth where, is it going to pass? Is it not going to pass? And all the communications that we had and all of the, the chat that was going at the moment. It's like, it was just like a big release for me. Like, oh my God, it worked. Like every ounce of energy that we put into this, like, paid off, because I don't think anybody in this call can actually imagine, the amount of time that went into this entire effort from everyone, from the attorneys and the communications and, the organizers. Like, there was so much energy that went into that. I feel like this one moment and one vote, that was like the moment of, like, thank you, it's working. Another piece of this for me was, and it really ran throughout this entire effort, was really the collegiality of everybody. Like Marissa said, like being seen, being heard, like being with like-minded people that like got you and you got them, and you were all like working towards like one common goal together. Like that never, that has very rarely happened in my political life. And to be able to have the support about, was something that I really deeply believed in, was eye-opening. And I realized, like, necessary now more than ever. Like, we really absolutely need people to be able to support the elected officials, in office when we're trying to do these like really big, like life-changing, community-changing things. And that's, to me, is like part of what like this coalition provided. Like it's possible. It's absolutely possible. And 3, legit, like really just drinks with you in Brooklyn, right? I mean, I've been working with people over Zoom for I don't know how long, and to be able to meet like Legia in person, and hopefully I'm really excited about meeting Marissa and Beth and John. Like, to me, like this is an ongoing relationship, and just to be able to see you in person and be able to like that was also a highlight too.
Drinks with Gail is definitely always a highlight. Beth, do you want to go?
No, just we don't have much time left. So I just want to echo what Marissa and Gail have said between the community organizing that made Gainesville possible to, the relationships that we built through our connections and our advocacy and our co-counseling has been amazing. And finally getting the complaint filed absolutely was one of those moments like, all the work that, all the organizers, Gail, Fran, the attorneys, everyone has put in actually culminated in that moment. And you definitely felt a release. So that was great.
All right, I'll turn it to John for your memory and to close us out.
Thanks, Legia. I think quickly, I would say, there are lots of individual moments, several of which have been highlighted already during this discussion. And then I just think that the teamwork has been amazing, and just all the ways that sort of members and different members of the team have contributed and brought their expertise and brought the sort of their strength and their connection to the work, whether that's, writing a complaint, connecting with, politicians across and local leaders across the state, connecting with community organizations. It's happened, and it happened from the very beginning and the very first meeting when we appeared before the Gainesville Commission to the filing of the complaint and the rollout, and will continue. And it's come from all of our organizations, including and especially Southern Poverty Law Center, and just, all the different contributions down the line has just been amazing. And it's really exciting to be part of a team that works together so nicely, and that just really brings lots of different strengths together. So it's really just been like an incredible honor to be on this journey with everybody. And with that, I want to thank all of our guests for being here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us with this program. Thank you so much to our incredible speakers. What an amazing panel. Legia, thank you so much for facilitating and contributing to the session. Beth, Gail, Marissa, and of course, Fran. We have so much gratitude for your insights and your wisdom. Thank you all for being here. Please don't forget to share these lessons and these insights with colleagues, with your network. Talk about it on social media, engage with us on social media. And, if you're interested and want to think about how you can take some of these lessons and apply it to your work elsewhere in Florida, somewhere else in the country, feel free to reach out to us and let us know how we can partner with all of you. And with that, say thank you and see you all soon.